follows an extract from my book Fête Fatale, available from Amazon. Chapter 15, Part 1. DCI James, Sergeant Maddox and Dr. Wainwright sat around the kitchen table, and Beth stood by the toaster feeding crumpets into the slots and buttering them. Drew emerged from his studio and joined the group for the food and conversation. I organised this little powwow because quite a minefield of information has come to light and we need to get our heads together, said James. I think you'll find that once you join me in this Alice in Wonderland type journey down the rabbit hole, all sense of perspective will fall strangely away. When John Barlow died and Dr. Wainwright here so perceptively felt that he couldn't satisfactorily issue the necessary death certificate, little did we realise how bizarre the trail would become. I'm not entirely sure where to begin, so perhaps Sergeant Maddox could set the ball rolling and tell us how his second meeting with Conrad Jefferson went. Sergeant Maddox blushed a little and hastily swallowed his mouthful of buttered crumpet. With a glug of his signature sweet tea, he described the outcome of his meeting. I'm afraid that there's not a lot to tell. I asked Jefferson about the money that he deposited into John's account straight off the bat, and he didn't flinch a bit. He seemed to presume that, having access to John's accounts, it was something that we'd always known. Do you know that he could remember John's bank number and sort code after just glancing over some statements that John showed him when he was asking Jefferson's advice? I tell you, that's worrying. Also, he referred to £15,000 as a paltry amount. He didn't seem to think it was enough to signify in our investigation. When I informed him that it did figure in our thinking, if you'll pardon the pun, he was quite ready to offer an explanation, though it's not what you'd have expected. Jefferson said that the money was a goodwill gesture to buy John a bit of thinking time. He said that John wasn't thinking straight and thought it would take the pressure off a bit so that he could clear his head. Jefferson admitted that he'd made a tidy sum out of his recent tangle with alternative accounting, and as he could remember John's bank account details, he instructed his secretary to make the deposit. She confirmed that this was the case and that Jefferson gave her the necessary bank numbers out of his head. This was quite normal, apparently. Jefferson did say that John seemed too embarrassed to accept the money, and so he suggested that it be considered a loan, though he didn't expect to see the money again. As the money wasn't returned, he presumed that John had swallowed his pride and accepted the gift. For what it's worth, I have to say that I believed him, sir. He never conducted any business with John, or not as far as we know, so how else can we account for it? I guess anything is possible. We'll leave it as it stands for now. What else is there that you can tell us? Asked James. I've spoken to Barlow's solicitor, continued Maddox. We'd already guessed that Jean is now a very rich woman owing to a long-standing life insurance policy. Even though she doesn't now need the ready cash, she's instructed that all properties except the home here in Mossleigh be put up for sale. Her reasoning is that she can't cope with the hassle and doesn't understand business. That seems fair enough, said James. It's a part of John's life that she never had any dealings in, and it's a bit late in the day to try and learn now, even if she had the inclination. Even so, there's a sad irony to it. She's now selling the house in France, which is quite a magnificent structure if what I hear is true. This was the very property that John didn't dare venture to suggest should be sold for Jean's sake. A quick sale there would have been more likely and highly profitable. The property market in that part of Europe is quite vigorous, and they would have made more than enough to tide him over this recent bumpy patch. You can't really expect Jean to go there now, though, can you? She's not likely to want to go on her own, is she? Said Drew. It's a sorry state of affairs, however you view it. I gave young Maddox here a list of names to see if Jefferson could or would shed any light on them, said James. Now this is where things get very surreal, and my mind still boggles when I link what I'm about to tell you with the name of John Barlow. Maddox interrupted James's flow. I'm sorry, sir, I clean forgot to tell you about that. I did show the list to Jefferson. He said that he didn't know the top 2 names on the list, but he knew the last 2 names enough to know that if you saw those names attached to a business deal, you walked away. He said that it didn't matter how lucrative the deal was, it was a matter of self-preservation to leave well alone. That fits with my findings, said James. Salvatore and Magella are a dastardly duo in the Spanish property market. I can see how John's troubles could edge into their territory, as their names are associated with the recent property bubble and subsequent financial crisis. As far as I can understand, property investment in Spain has been out of control for some time now. I'm sure we're all aware that not so many years ago, simply loads of retired UK residents were using their golden handshake retirement funds to buy property in Spain, so that they could live the high life and watch EastEnders sitting outside on the balcony or by the pool during the winter months. Whole villages in Spain became colonised by expats. As a prime tourist spot, real estate companies made Spain into an important place for investment. This would be where Jefferson's company would come in, and Barlow was hanging on to the shirt tails of the big fish like Jefferson. James took a gulp of his coffee before he continued. At about this time, a change in Spanish legislation allowed local communities to have a greater involvement in town planning. On the surface, this would appear to be a good thing. It allowed the locals to have a say in what was or was not built in their own towns. This is where our terrible twosome comes in. Using their contacts, they manoeuvred themselves onto various committees, and your average fisherman was no match against the mafioso officials who could manipulate sales and development to their own ends. At the same time, these undesirables maintained their usual business of low-level tobacco smuggling into the UK and had even progressed to the sale of more serious narcotics. Business of this kind is usually conducted in bars and nightclubs, so John's business interests overlap here on both the property and the smuggling fronts. He may have even got entangled against his own wishes, as he wouldn't necessarily know about the day-to-day dealings of his bar manager in Spain until it was too late. Crikey, he really was in over his head, said Maddox. We don't know that he was definitely involved, but he was certainly beginning to sail a little close to the wind, said James. The first 2 names on the list that I gave you, Frankos and Alexis Spiros, are known as the Greek Mafia. We know that John had rental properties in Greece, but the recent euro crash had rendered these obsolete for the time being. Nobody could afford the rent. These 2 unsavouries are part of a group known as the Godfathers of the Night, if you'll believe it, because of their association with nightclubs from where they base their smuggling operations. They run a protection racket over the businessmen in the area, as well as the usual tobacco and narcotics line. They've never been convicted, as it's rumoured that they have their links on the inside of the police force there, who keep them ahead of the game. It may be that John was considering, or being persuaded, to convert his empty property into a bar or nightclub for their purposes. We know that they have contacts in New York, but it's not known if they operate in the UK. I see what you mean about shattering any sense of perspective. It'd be laughable if it weren't actually happening, said Drew. It all sounds so far-fetched. The man was out of his league. It would certainly justify the theory of a stress-induced coronary, said Wainwright. Indeed it would, but I'm afraid that the case is no longer so straightforward, said James. If you consider that as straightforward, then I dread to think what's next on the agenda, said Beth. For the full book of Fête Fatale, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.